Coming up on today's podcast.
We just have to stand outside. We just have to go around our coastlines. We've in the UK, we've got one of the biggest tidal movements of any country. And it's quite windy too. We've got the occasional mountain where you could pump water up to the top and store. So we've got this enormous resource, and we just seem to have been doing it in a half-assed way forever.
The storage aspect is a very big and important thing, because wind power regularly generates far more power than the grid can cope with. And in fact, they're wasting energy. I think it was around 1 million homes that the energy that they waste quite often could be powered by this technology. And they're having to it's costing them to shut down wind turbines. But one of the things that they're looking at is a good way of storing that excess energy so that it's not wasted.
Hello and welcome to another edition of How to Understand Today, your weekly insight into the fast-moving and often perplexing world of technology. I'm Simon Wyndham.
I'm Dave Shapton.
I'm Phil Rhodes.
Now, in the world of tech, there's one area that stirs up a whole hornet's nest of debate, from visions of a utopia of cheap and clean energy on the one hand to wind turbines affecting Wales' sense of direction on the other, if to put any stock in the ramblings of a certain US politician. But while we're going to steer clear of any direct political ramblings, we are going to tackle the many questions surrounding renewable and green energy. What's the truth behind its future? What are the most realistic and practical developments? Can it keep up with demand with UK-based listeners when they're boiling their kettles during the advertisement break for Coronation Street? All that and much more will hopefully be answered during the course of our conversation. Phil, I'd like to begin with you. One of the questions around many green technologies concerns their viability, not least because we're used to seeing hundreds of promised new developments, often to do with battery technology, and then they seemingly disappear off the face of the planet, never to be seen again. What do you see as some of the biggest obstacles to making green and renewable energy as a whole the majority of our power output? And why do you think there's so much suspicion among certain sections of society and political discourse surrounding it?
Well, I think there's probably some reason to be suspicious of almost any political discourse on almost any topic from professional politicians. So, I mean, that's almost something I'd seek to separate from the technological considerations. But why is it difficult? Because those considerations get tangled up. Because politics and technology on projects of the scale that would be required to do anything useful always get tangled up. I mean, I think in the UK, it's been the case that we've had, many tens of percent of energy developed from renewable sources at certain times. So it's not like nothing has been done. And this is not, to say that this is a technology that's never going to do more than a handful of it is simply untrue. And that's been shown. But the problem is persuading people of that and ensuring that people are adequately sure that what they're going to get is what they want before it's done. I think part of the problem is that it hasn't been done and it's been known about for so long, and we have had solutions for a long time to many of the problems that energy consumption creates. And I think it's now more than ever it's important, because if we're going to start talking about everyone having electric cars, and certainly in the UK we're trying to move away from people using even gas for central heating and hot water, if everything's going to be electricity, then we're going to need this. We're going to need this to be better. I think the frustration for me is that people overlook the fact that it's very hard. I'm going to say this several times during this conversation, I'm sure. It's very hard to beat free. Now, nothing's free. To say that, people say that you can look up the numbers for this and there'll be 1,000,001 different numbers depending on who you ask. But to try and beat the fact that you can throw a load of solar panels out in the desert somewhere, and they will sit there and soak up sunshine and give you electricity on not no maintenance, but very, very, very little maintenance. It's very hard to beat that in terms of other power sources. And then you get off into storage and what people call batteries. It doesn't necessarily have to be batteries, but we'll get into all of this. But it's a tension between what the politics wants. And I often avoid the word green, because green is politics. Low carbon energy is a technology. I can't solve, you can't engineer your way around politics. You can engineer your way around renewable energy. And I think that it's being overlooked because of that tension between those two aspects of it.
So Dave, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, other than agreeing with Phil, what staggers me is that, if only there was a giant fusion reactor in the sky. It's not like we have to go looking for renewable energy. We just have to stand outside. We just have to go around our coastlines. We've in the UK, we've got one of the biggest tidal movements of any country, and it's quite windy too. We've got the occasional mountain where you could pump water up to the top and store. We'll come on to this, and when we talk about batteries. And I think when we were talking earlier, I think we're going to agree that we use the word battery for any kind of storage of energy. So we've got this enormous resource, and we just seem to have been doing it in a half-assed way forever. And yeah, it's better than it was. But when you look at the number of factory roofs, even domestic housing roofs, covered car parks, shopping centres, these are all places that could have solar power, probably some wind power as well. And I think it's really just strange that we haven't harnessed this. What's going to change it? I don't know. I don't know why there might be an intrinsic political resistance to this, except that it revolves around the subject of climate change, and it's kind of fashionable if you vote a certain way to actually deny man-made climate change. So
yeah, I mean, on that, for me, I always find this whole thing perplexing in two ways. One is, as you've alluded to, there are so many different ways that we could generate clean energy. And on the face of it, there would be, for the kinds of politicians who might be against it, there is actually a lot of money potentially to be made from that, which is puzzling as to why there is so much backlash from certain quarters. So yeah, it is quite stunning that isn't the case. But also, even if people didn't believe in climate change, there might be people listening to this who are climate change deniers. Even if you're correct, there is nothing to be lost by having cleaner energy. There is nothing to be lost by having cleaner air to breathe. So it is quite confusing for me as to why it has been so difficult to get clean and renewable energy accepted as a concept.
And it generates employment as well. It boosts the economy. It's an industry.
I could play devil's advocate, though. I mean, let's do that for the sake of not misrepresenting the argument. I mean, I know I have even seen very few people who absolutely deny climate change. What you get is people saying, well, yes, I accept that it's happening, and I accept that it's anthropogenic, and it's caused by humans, but I don't think it matters, which is the attitude of somebody who doesn't live on Tuvalu, but, one of the islands that's likely to be overtaken by rising sea levels. And there's quite a lot, many of them in sort of Micronesia and places like that. That's grotesquely irresponsible if you don't care, I think, but that's entirely up to you. The argument over whether it's less expensive or more expensive is a complex one, but I think it's becoming very difficult to claim that, say, nuclear power, which does produce nasty effluent, but of course you've got it in a nice little box so you can put it somewhere safe and perhaps that's okay, somehow. It's getting difficult to say that the entire life cycle of a nuclear power plant is cheaper per kilowatt hour than other things. The problem is, and you want the genuine problem, the problem is storage. I don't know how well solar would ever work here. Tidal's perhaps better, wind's perhaps better. And it all comes down to storage. And I think that people have referred to that as batteries. And that's led people to believe that all of our grid scale energy storage, i.e. energy storage on a scale large enough to supply the entire country or large chunks of it, has to come from the same sort of battery technology you have in your electric car, which it doesn't. And I think the word batteries is overused in that context. Perhaps that's part of it.
Yeah, I mean, the storage aspect is a very big and important thing because, I was reading that wind power regularly generates far more power than the grid can cope with. And in fact, they're wasting energy. I think it was about around 1 million homes that the energy that they waste quite often could be powered by this technology. And they're having to it's costing them to shut down wind turbines so that it doesn't overload the grid. And there are various reasons why this is the case. I think there's a lot of, it's the distribution of power across the country, getting it from Scotland down to the south and that kind of thing. But one of the things that they're looking at is a good way of storing that excess energy so that it's not wasted.
I mean, let's just look at some of the ways that are not batteries that you can store electricity. And I mean, some of them, in a sort of geeky, nerdy way, really are quite appealing. I mean, you've really got to be open-minded about this. I mean, one of the least likely, if you haven't ever come across it before, is you can store energy by rotating a very large cylindrical chunk of metal. It's called flywheel technology. And you can spin, like, I think the biggest one ever, don't quote me on this, the biggest one ever was like 140 tons, and it spun 30,000 times a minute. I mean, you probably demolish the entire city if that thing came off its bearings.
See, that's a bomb, isn't it?
That's a lot of energy. And if you've ever wondered why they don't use them to power cars, probably there's a huge gyroscopic effect with that. So a train maybe, but if you ever need to go round a corner, you come badly unstuck. But as a principle, basically it's converting electricity into kinetic energy. The beauty of flywheels is they're already spun up. So if you're in some critical situation, like in a hospital, or even, I think they use them quite commonly for radio transmitters, where if the transmitter's main power goes off, it would take a minute or two to spin up a diesel generator, but flywheels are already spun up because they're kinetic energy. So you could literally switch across to it, and there wouldn't even be a glitch. The disadvantage is that however smooth you make the surfaces, however good you make the bearings, however much you surround it with a vacuum, friction is going to come to play, and they don't keep spinning forever. And just another technique is salt. Salt has unusual properties. It's a very stable chemical. You can heat it and cool it millions of times and it doesn't degrade. I think it melts at 550 degrees Celsius.
Yes.
And so it's pretty useful, given that you have to heat it, pretty useful for some of these incredible solar farms where instead of using photovoltaic cells, they have mirrors and a giant tower, like in the middle of this sort of multi-kilometer diameter field of mirrors. And they all focus the sun onto a collector at the top of the tower, which is basically a multifaceted mirror. And that heat is focused on a lump of salt. And the other property about salt is that it has a very high specific heat capacity. Now, water's got a fairly high specific heat capacity. In other words, if you make a cup of tea, it stays warm for quite a long time. If you run the bath, it stays warm for quite a long time. That's a function of its specific heat capacity. I'm amazed at my ability to recall O-level physics here. But salt has a high multiple of that in terms of its specific heat capacity. So bizarre though it may seem, bath of liquid salt can be efficiently converted back into electricity. There's loads of ways, and I'm sure Phil's got others, but
yeah. I mean, the thing about I've seen quite high efficiencies, Glenn. Now, one of the things about any of these techniques, whether you're pumping water up a hill, which does require the right terrain features, and we don't have enormous mountains in the UK, or whether you're using molten salt, as you were just saying, they all have an efficiency, and they're always going to be less than 100%. Although I have seen 90s of % claimed for salt. Now, what you probably want to do is put your molten salt inside a vacuum flask, effectively, which make it more complicated. And really, that speaks to an argument about how efficient you want it to be, how difficult you want it to be to build, and what you want the maintenance to be like. Because this is one of the big arguments. So, I mean, solar power in the UK doesn't necessarily work as well as it does in some other places. If you drive from Vegas to LA, you see the Ivanpah nuclear solar power station, which uses fundamentally this technique you've just described. It doesn't have storage as far as I'm aware. Although there's one, I believe, in South America somewhere that does. And it stores tanks of molten salt. It pumps molten salt around its cooling loop, and it has big tanks of molten salt. And they've got some quite high efficiency numbers. Although this is one of the sort of difficult engineering way ups. Like if you have a photovoltaic cell, it produces electricity from sunlight straight away. Now, the efficiency of those is not that great. 15, 20% of the photons that get collected get turned into electrons. So the efficiency of a direct conversion cell is not that great. But if you put it out in the desert on a frame, pointing roughly towards the sun, you walk away for years, and it will just sit there and work. They do degrade over time, but not too badly in decades. Now, it's really hard to beat free. Now, once you built this thing, it's just honey at that point, and you've got no problems. Now, what you might say is, well, I can get better efficiency if I get a bunch of mirrors and reflect it all onto a tower. But okay, these mirrors now have to be what we call heliostats. They have to change an angle as the sun moves around to make sure we're always focusing all the sunlight onto this central tower. So now all of that's going to be something that needs maintenance, and someone with a kind of WD-40 and a set of wrenches is going to have to go out and hit it with a hammer every so often to make sure these things keep moving. And as you'll know, if you've driven past Ivanpah, you look out over the mirror field, there's 3 of them in a row, and you'll always see a couple of mirrors that are just flat because they're waiting for repair. Because when you've got that many mirrors, there's always going to be a couple that have failed, which means that you've got to have a guy in a truck with a toolbox that's got to go out and keep fixing them. Is it worth that for the increased efficiency? Especially, is it worth that for the increased efficiency and the fact that a molten salt coolant loop comes with built-in storage? This is a difficult engineering decision to make. I don't know what the answer to that is. As far as I know, the answer will change depending on exactly what local conditions are, how sunny it is, how much sun you're expecting, what the local power loading is likely to be. So there's some quite difficult engineering decisions, although that doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't work. But there's some non-obvious stuff. You might think, well, I love all that, but you know what? On this occasion, for these circumstances, it's easier just to put a big solar field out there of photovoltaic cells and just do it that way. These are choices.
So why aren't we doing that? Why isn't every surface covered in photocells?
And I think the obvious one is, well, there's obviously local objections as well. People who not in my neighbourhood. You see all sorts of objections to the solar panels in the fields for.
I'm just curious, what are their objections? I think they look rather nice.
Well, I think they're fine, but you also see very misinformed objections, such as where are the sheep going to graze? And as we were discussing before we started recording, sheep actually quite like grazing underneath the solar panel. It's not a thing. It's perfectly viable and is done all the time.
You just have to cut the grass anyway.
Well, yes, exactly. I found it interesting when you're talking about the efficiency of solar panels, but what rarely comes up when people are discussing the efficiency of renewables is what the efficiency of a coal-powered power station is.
Oh, yeah.
And, when you think about some countries who still want to go down that route, what is it, something like 30%, 40%?
It's horrifyingly bad.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the problems that come with renewables, in terms of establishing on every surface, as it were, come from misinformed objections. Recently there's been a development for a pane of glass that could work in skyscrapers that acts as a power generating solar panel. So you can imagine every single skyscraper having this in it, or every single home having it in it. It might, in a house, it might be a relatively small amount of power that's generated, but you kind of got to look at things added up, all put in together, and all the different ways of generating this electricity.
Let's just go back to the efficiency thing, because I think it's actually really good to compare like a coal fire station. I don't have the figures, but just my empirical sense is we're just up the road from Ratcliffe-on-Soar power station. It's in Nottinghamshire and it's enormous. It's recently been decommissioned, but until the middle of last year, it was the reserve power station for London. So it could practically power the whole of London, and it would routinely be switched in to help with that. And it's right next to a busy road and the railway line. And so you get a marvellous view of it from miles away. You can see, in fact, from this house, you can see the cooling towers, and they look enormous. And this is 13 miles from it. So as you get closer to it, before they close it down, you'd start to see some piles of coal. And yeah, you think that's a pile of coal. And then you realise that the little dots at the bottom of the pile of coal that you thought were ants are actually 40.
Yeah.
And then you get closer to the cooling towers. Apart from trying to describe the scale of the universe, which is almost impossible, the scale of these cooling towers is incredible. Now, you imagine the basic operation which is to shovel from that mountain of coal into furnaces, burn the coal, which is inefficient in itself and incredibly destructive to the environment, and then heat up water to boiling point in some pipes, feed that water into some turbines, spin those lossy turbines, and then using electromagnetism generate electricity, which then has to go through a lossy grid. But I can't even guess at the inefficiency of all of that.
37%, apparently, according to this. Typical fossil fuel power station will make about 37%.
Yeah, which is actually not quite as bad as I thought, but that's still
poor.
Pretty poor when you consider the amount of raw materials you're putting into it.
On one hand, yes. On the other hand, it's probably not quite fair to say, well, apparently the record for a solar cell was achieved in 2022 by a Fraunhofer project, which achieved 47.5%. So the thing is, it's not really very fair to sort of say, well, this is the efficiency with which this thing converts sunlight into electricity, and this is the efficiency with this thing converts burning coal into electricity, because I'm not that worried how much sunlight we waste.
That's the point. The sun's going to be doing what it's doing for another 5 billion years.
The sun is renewable, the coal is not.
Yeah. So I think when you're using the NIMBY argument, I don't want solar panels in my backyard. I think you've got to take the whole context into account. And I think if you do, there just aren't any arguments against it.
No. I mean, I think, this whole issue of storage, sorry to go back to that, but it is going to become important because when it comes to the wind power and them having to shut down turbines, apparently if they don't get the storage problem sorted out, it could add around £200 to everyone's electricity bill per year. So it is, when we talk about renewable energy being cheaper than traditional means, when we have problems like this in our midst, then, they really do need to be sorted out so that it can live up to its potential.
Sorry, Phil, go ahead.
No, I was going to say about, one of the things that's been posited as a solution to storage is that we actually are starting to connect huge numbers of batteries to the power grid in the form of cars. And distributed storage has been mooted in as much as perhaps when you go out to your car in the morning, it's at 95% rather than 100%, because that top 5% was siphoned off to support the grid demand of everyone making their breakfast. And that might be fine. And you would get compensated for that, obviously, and make sure that it was financially all equitable, and that would be perfectly fine.
I think that's a massively great answer.
I mean, the cars won't currently do that, but they could.
Some can. Some are starting to be able to do that. And I think in Australia, they're starting to have what they call virtual power stations, which is essentially this distributed storage via people's cars. Nobody would find it inconvenient, and they'd make a little bit of money from it. So that's obviously not the only answer, but I think as well, it's only economics which is holding back storage, because the simplest and probably friendliest to the environment storage is simply pumping water up a mountain. There have also been projects where instead of water, you wind a gigantic weight up an enormous tower and then just release it. This kind of thing doesn't need rare earth materials. No. It doesn't take any resources. It's as basic an engineering project as you could imagine.
I mean, what I'm sort of guessing from a lot of what I read about this is that the problem with becoming 100% green energy isn't so much the generation of the electricity, but it's just maybe an antiquated way of distributing the power. The fact that at the moment, renewable energy prices are still not decoupled from fossil fuel prices, which means that people can't get the benefit of that in terms of price. It just staggers me that there hasn't been any kind of huge movement to get that done. I mean, I have my suspicions as to why it hasn't been done, but it's something that must be done. If we're talking about people not being able to afford electricity, it's a no-brainer to decouple the renewable energy price, wholesale price from that of fossil fuels. It's completely mind-blowing to me that
Yeah, completely. And I think, we've got to overcome this resistance to building the infrastructure, because we've one of the roadblocks is getting the electricity, even when there is the demand from the wind farms to, let's say, the southeast of England, because, a lot of the wind farms tend to be out at sea. And so, for example, Essex, Suffolk, they want to put a new power line in. And it's an area of natural beauty. There's no doubt about that. And the obvious thing is to put it underground, but that's more expensive. So they just want to fly it across on. But Phil made the point before, which is that you can always take the pylons down. It's not like you're demolishing a mountain or something like that with explosives.
No,
filling a cave with nuclear waste. I mean, that you can't undo, and that's a bit of a problem. This whole thing about people not liking, I get pylons. I mean, I get people don't like the look of it, but really, if the choice is, one of our last large-scale combustion plants in the UK is called Drax, and it's this giant industrial city up in northern England somewhere. And if the choice is a few pylons that you can see from your garden or Drax, I find it hard to say Drax. More Drax, please. It's hideous, it's cooling towers and belching steam. But yeah, as regards why it's not being done, I think the answer is that partly there would be risk involved, because there's always risk in any new technology. You can't build a new technology without there being some risk of it not working. And I would use as an example of that the fact that not only have we not really gone for as many renewables as we could have done, we haven't even gone for better nuclear. And I think one of the most ringing indictments of the nuclear industry at the moment is that what it's proposing to build, and indeed is building in this country as I speak, is fundamentally the same boiling water reactors they were building in the 70s, with better electronics running them. Really, that's what it is. And yes, there are a few improvements, and we're not building Chernobyls exactly. Chernobyl was a boiling water reactor, but we haven't even developed new nuclear technologies. And I think, again, it's simply because of risk aversion. And I get it, it's a risk, but, there is a certain outcome that we're careering towards here that is going to be terrible for everyone, and already is terrible for everyone. And people say, well, electricity might get really expensive. Like, I'm sorry, at what point do you have to accept that electricity is already ruinously expensive?
What about what we say to the fact that countries like France have had a successful nuclear industry seemingly forever, and they generate a high percentage of their domestic supply from nuclear? Are they just lucky they've never had an accident, and are they particularly clever about secreting away the radioactive waste?
Yeah.
This is wanting to do it.
Yeah.
People say these things, but in terms of nuclear stuff, it's not like reactor fuel is that cheap anyway. It's not like reactor fuel. Where does reactor fuel come from? Well, the clue's in the name, uranium. Where's uranium from? A lot of this stuff comes out of Russia, which is somewhere we'd rather not fund, perhaps, at the moment. Hopefully that won't be a long-term problem, but, so it's not like that's cheap. People have said nuclear power is cheap. There's been some pretty creative accounting done, I think, to show that nuclear power is cheap. And
I think the mistake comes from thinking, well, actually, nuclear potential power is enormous. Somebody said you could power an ocean liner across the Atlantic with 1 gram of plutonium.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that is staggering. But you can't just hit a gram of plutonium with a hammer and off you go. You've got infinite power. It's the stuff you have to build around it, and the safety and the hazardous nature of the byproducts.
Yeah. In fact, there's something to say about Chernobyl in that regard, because one of the things, of course, here I'm about to speak up for the design of the reactor at Chernobyl, so hold on to your hats. One of the things about that reactor is that it did run on low enriched uranium, which is why I suppose you could, without going into all the details, you could pretty much view it as having to run this reactor with your foot flat on the floor the entire time to get it to even work, which is why it was tended to be a little bit iffy if you got it under certain circumstances. And one of the safety reactions to the Chernobyl disaster was to increase the enrichment of the fuel very slightly, which made it more expensive. But it was supposed to be, and they were very big. The RBMK reactors at Chernobyl and Ignalina and other places are very physically big. They're very high power. and they run on comparatively cheap fuel. So they were actually a fairly inexpensive way of doing nuclear power, almost to a fault, we might add, but that's a well enough covered topic. What we haven't done is we haven't looked at, lifters, reactors that can actually run the tailings from rare earth extraction. Mounds of tailings that when you're extracting certain rare elements from the Earth's crust, that you create radioactive spoil. And it's radioactive because you could use it as reactor fuel. None of that's been developed. Pebble bed reactors, not developed. Lifters, not developed. And as for fusion, I mean, good grief, when's that going to happen? It's going to be coming for 20 years.
In 5 years, Phil, that's when it's...
Yeah, in 5 years.
5 years from whenever you are, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's worth saying with fusion, it's a little bit like traveling across the galaxy through a wormhole. It's theoretically possible. It's monumentally difficult to achieve. Now, successful fusion reactions have been achieved.
Oh, sure.
In the very strict sense that they have managed to take out more energy than they put in for a split second.
They haven't managed to self-sustain it, have they?
God, no.
Yeah, but in order to do that, you have to have temperatures as hot as the sun, and you have to create a plasma, which is like a state of matter that we don't normally encounter because it would blow your socks off if you ever did. It's basically where molecules and atoms fly apart and you just have this cloud of atomic particles at an incredible heat. And to keep that in place, you have to use immense magnetic fields inside a thing called, I think it's called a tokamak.
It's one way.
Yeah. And so if that goes wrong, the whole thing just kind of explodes. Not in a nuclear explosion, but it's just like, it's very, very messy. So it's not like you can, turn on a tap with this stuff. It's highly contingent on critical technology. And that's why it's always like 5, 10, 20 years from where we are now.
Yeah.
One instance of that is if you've ever seen the movie Tron, and I'm not talking about the 2010 Tron Legacy, I'm talking about the original 1980, whatever it was, Tron. The lab in which they zap the guy into the computer has, if you look at it, there's some great shots looking down on it, and we crane over it slowly because we're riding on the actual crane in the building. And this building was, I think the building's still there, but the experiment's not. That was an experiment called Shiva, and it was an inertial confinement fusion experiment. And I bring this up only because it's kind of hilariously American. No offense to our American viewers, but this is a wonderfully American way of doing fusion. In as much as you take ordinarily, as Dave's just been explaining, you heat things up and you add electric heaters and magnetic inductive heaters, and it's all very complex. The inertial confinement thing, the reason they use the term inertial confinement is that you get your pellet of fuel, which is often gold, and the idea is that you dump energy into it before it has time to fly apart, which at that one meant firing enormous lasers at it very intensely. And all of the white tubes that you can see in Tron on the side of this giant sort of structure that's inside the Lawrence Livermore lab are the spatial filters for the Shiva laser. They called it Shiva because it had multiple arms like the deity. And yeah, inertial confinement fusion is giant lasers, and you create fusion by dumping so much energy into the target area that the target can't get out of the way fast enough. So the American approach was big lasers, which I thought was fantastic. And I don't know that it's being pursued anymore, but that experiment certainly isn't. But
well, I'm glad they did it for its, if only for its science fiction realization potential.
Yeah.
Jeff Bridges into a video game, so,
Yeah.
Going on from big frickin' lasers, like, I think there seems to be a lack of sort of thinking in terms of being clever as opposed to thinking big. As you said at the beginning, Dave, they had this idea of every surface being a potential energy generator is quite an important point to make because, we've covered the idea of solar panels in windows, or windows being the solar panels. But there was a company that was developing a few years ago, and again, it's one of those things that just disappeared and for no apparent reason. I don't know if they're still going, but they developed a road panel system. So it was made from glass, and it made absolute sense. These panels could be replaced. You wouldn't have to dig up a road. You just take out the damaged panel and you put a new one in. But you could put solar panels within the roads. You could put your broadband infrastructure within the road. You could put different other parts of infrastructure within this road, and so you wouldn't have so much disruption if anything needed repairing. And I think the estimation was, and I know this is probably a calculation they made without the idea that any cars were actually driving over the road, so it probably doesn't bear any fruit in terms of a realistic figure, but they did calculate that if every road in the United States we used the system and had the solar panels within it, they could generate 3 times more power than the United States used by doing this. I've no idea what happened to it, but to me that sounded like a really clever idea. And even if it only partially worked, I think it would be, a neat system, because it not only adds to renewable energy generation, but it also makes much more sense when it comes to horrendous roadworks and repairing things like that.
There's something to be said about, even if it only makes a small contribution. And one of the things I've noticed about renewable energy is that when people talk about it, particularly people who want to decry it and do it down, they will say, well, this is the amount of energy we create, and this is the amount that we're creating using this one technology. And seek to say, well, it can't possibly be enough, it can't possibly do the job. Well, hang on a minute. I mean, no one technology, no one idea has to do in fact, it would be a bad idea to, because that would be an eggs and baskets problem. And the idea that, we shouldn't use this technology at all because it can't shoulder the entire load all the time is absurd. And I mean, of course, storage becomes a factor and all those things are important. But to say, well, wind power can't possibly ever replace all of our nuclear power stations. Well, no, but maybe a combination of wind power and other things can. And I think that sort of absolutism is not helpful. And the idea that we have to magically find the funding somehow to dump every type of energy generation that we have and then do only solar tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, look at what we had before we had a national power grid. Everybody made their own power with a fire or, by pedaling their cycle. So the idea that we have to have a sort of homogeneous new energy source is nonsense. We absolutely should have a hybrid system. And I come back to my original point, which is that renewable energy is abundant. And I mean, I know it's probably ludicrous to suggest building a power line that goes around the equator and, so that we can make use of, you've always got access to an area where there is sunlight.
That is one of the problems with what the geopolitics of this might be, is that places which have abundant space and sunlight might start doing a lot better than places that don't. Places that have loads of coastline might start doing better than places that don't. But particularly the sunshine thing, because as I say, there are options to just, if you've got infinite space, then you can just chuck loads of solar panels out there and they will work for large periods. Get someone to go past with a broom and brush the dust off every so often. It will just keep working. The odd cooling fan. Places with lots of space and sunlight who are not stuck for physical acreage will probably find that just using photovoltaics is a better bet than using other things. Bearing in mind, it's always light on about half the equator. So countries that are nearer the equator have lots of space and sunlight will start doing better. And that's going to be a really big change to the geopolitical layout of the world, because those are not the places that are currently running the world.
Yeah, especially when when you've reached peak oil and your oil usage is declining, and you just end up with a few examples of this sticky black liquid that nobody wants to use.
I mean, just on that, I mean, it's a slight diversion from our main topic, but one thing that was brought up by an engineer I heard fairly recently was that we will still need oil for certain things. I think one of the things he cited was it bearing grease or something, and he said there's no synthetic that can do the job quite as well as something made from oil. I know nothing about that subject, so I can't really say whether he's.
I would venture to speculate that the quantity of oil we need for bearing lubrication is many orders of magnitude less than we need to.
Well, it is, but then there comes that cost thing, doesn't it? If you've got a great big thing extracting oil from somewhere, but you're only using it for small things, how expensive does that oil become?
So to what extent do we think that a move to renewable energy has just gone into reverse in the United States?
I think I just but my impression of it is that naturally a lot of companies and people are don't want oil. They want to be using renewable energy. I think that no matter how much some of the madder politicians over there want to increase oil production, I think naturally the way the momentum is going, I think is going to go against that.
I've seen some mapping that showed how much solar, I think this was Elon actually, so I hesitate to bring up, but I've seen some mapping that showed various sizes of area of solar panel on a map of the United States. It said, this is how much solar panel we'd need, assuming batteries, to accommodate the entire United States electricity supply. It's disgustingly doable. And you've got to say, well, it'll cost billions. Yeah, but what's the value long? This is the problem with short-termist government, and this is inevitably going to become political. But when you've got a government that only really looks at a 5-year time span and even day-to-day only looks at a 6-week news cycle, they can't make decisions like we're really going to go for a solution whereby we don't have to worry about nuclear waste and obtaining oil anymore. And then, of course, the geopolitics of it comes in, and you say, well, hang on a minute, this is going to cause a crisis of blue-collar employment because all the people who work on the oil fields, all the people who work in the combustion power stations. Well, yeah, but we're also going to need an enormous number of people to start bolting solar cells to frames and some qualified electricians to wire it all up. So it's not like we don't generate some work doing this. Yes, people say, oh, we're shipping all these solar panels halfway around the world from Korea quite often. Why are we doing that? Is there a reason we can't be building them? And then you can create the situation where with a bit of maintenance, yes, fine, you'd be a sort of rolling replacement program of the oldest ones and so on and so forth. But with a relatively inexpensive, not particularly difficult, no exotic procedures or processes or materials, you could sort your energy problem and never think about it again.
It's like if only there were more sand in the world.
Yeah. Well, what are they made of? Silicon,
But I mean, you're absolutely right, Phil. And this is the thing, there's no it's often portrayed in the US as people losing their jobs. But actually, no, it's retraining. There's no reason why anyone should be losing their job. They can go into a different job and use their mechanical or technical expertise in a different area. But as well as that, it's all very well saying you're going to generate a whole lot more. Generate some oil. I think you produce more oil. You can produce all the oil you want, but if nobody wants it, if nobody wants to buy it, then it's a bit pointless.
Yeah, I think that I don't want to be too glib about this. If you work in an industry and your industry is under threat from some modernization, and you can retrain. I mean, yeah, we've all heard that, and sometimes that doesn't work out so well for people. If you're coming up to retirement and thinking, oh, I don't want to change my job. I feel I get it. I mean, but we cannot allow a blanket fear of change to completely destroy any prospect of helping.
No, and to get us across that line, it's worth noting that, for example, what if your washing machine was powered by a diesel engine? Or your toaster? I have to say, I mean, I now drive a car with an electric powertrain. It's slightly unusual because it also has a petrol engine that charges the battery. It's unconventional hybrid because there is no mechanical connection between the petrol engine and the wheels. It is 100% an electric drivetrain. And I must say, I really like it. I think electric cars are amazing. I can't see why we're not doing more to facilitate this.
Because it would require political decision-making, and that might make somebody unpopular.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as well as that, electric cars are another thing where there's a lot of misinformation going around about them. You hear all kinds of ridiculous things, such as how on earth are our multi-story car parks going to take the weight? How are our bridges going to take the weight of all these electric cars with their batteries? How is the grid going to cope? Well, the National Grid in the UK has said it can cope quite fine, thank you very much.
Yes.
So the one thing we haven't touched upon, Phil, with regard to electric cars is that, again, in 5 years' time, solid state batteries that were supposed to keep making an appearance.
Real soon.
This is the year that was originally marked for mass production for automobile-sized batteries. I haven't actually looked up to see how well that's going, but even Microsoft was part of it.
Yeah.
What do you know about the current situation, Phil?
Well, being a technology journalist, having been a technology journalist for 10 plus years, one thing I have noticed is that I used to get an enormous number of press releases about new battery technologies. And they were all drivel. I mean, like one good example of this was what they were calling the nuclear diamond battery.
Oh God, I remember that.
Tremendously incredible. This was proposed on the basis that it was... there's a reason I'm using this example, because it's a really good example of why you can come up with something that sounds superficially good but doesn't really work. The nuclear diamond battery was described as being a way to use up nuclear waste. Whoa. Having some ludicrously huge capacity. And of course, when you call it a diamond battery, everyone thinks, oh, diamonds are lovely. What it turns out they were doing is they were getting old reactor graphite. Now, most types of nuclear reactor, anybody who's seen Chernobyl will understand this, but most types of nuclear reactor in the Eastern Bloc and in the West do have chunks of graphite in them, and you would prefer they didn't get radioactive, but they inevitably do because they get neutron activated because they're in this nuclear furnace their entire operating lives. So one of the nuclear wastes that you create when you decommission a power station is all these blocks of graphite, and they're radioactive. And there is such a thing as I should have looked this up, but it's rather like a photovoltaic device, only it works on nuclear radiation. It works on radioactive particles, and it does a direct conversion of radiation into electricity. So you think, well, great, I'll get some of this nuclear waste and I'll wrap this thing around it and I'll have a battery. And you do. But if you think about it, this stuff's going to keep decaying for as long as it decays for. Half of it will decay and whatever its half-life is. Well, the radioactive half-life of radioactive carbon is, but anyway. And it would last for thousands of years. So they'll say, oh, it's great, it's got this huge capacity, which it does because it's using radioactive decay, which gets access to E equals mc squared, and therefore huge amounts of energy come out of it. And it's got a really long half-life, so it lasts thousands of years, and the total capacity is ridiculous. But you can't turn it off. It's always going to keep discharging the whole time, and you only get that huge amount of energy over thousands and thousands of years. So, and that was an example of superficially plausible, but actually fairly useless battery technology.
I'm assuming the sort of day-to-day power from it was like...
Yeah, you're not going to run your phone off this thing or your video camera. This is never going to happen. And yeah, there were applications for it in low-load, long-duration things, which is why you get radioisotope thermoelectric generators, which are slightly different technology in satellites. But that's an example of a terrible, non-workable battery technology, which is emphatically not going to change the world. Might have some applications, not completely worthless, but it's not going to change the world, and it's not going to consume more than a tiny, tiny amount of the radioactive waste that's generated during decommissioning nuclear reactors, for crying out loud. But I would say in the last post-pandemic, the flow of crazy battery ideas has dropped off. I don't know if you guys have found the same thing.
Perhaps, although, going back to the whole thing about solid state batteries, you can buy solid state batteries that work, and they have made them for a proof of concept cars. I believe the main issue with them is mass producing them to a cost. For listeners who don't really know the ins and outs of solid state batteries, they have many advantages over traditional lithium-ion batteries. For one thing, they're not as dangerous or as explosive, which is quite a handy thing. But they charge much quicker. You can charge a car-sized battery to around 80% capacity in around 10 minutes or so, which makes them much more practical. And they don't suffer from the same degradation over charge cycles that traditional lithium-ion batteries do either. So there's a lot of advantages to having them. They're also, I believe they're half the weight to the same capacity as lithium ion as well, which also bodes well. And they can be made to any shape, which means that you can configure your car design and any other device, be it a phone or whatever. You can be much more flexible with that as well. So for me, it's one of those technologies that I really, really want to see succeed. But again, although we know they work and they know they can be produced, can they be made to mass produced to a cost, in that kind of size and quantity?
Well, that was always the problem with the blue LED, is they knew exactly what it needed to be, but there wasn't really a methodology for making it at any sort of scale, which was why there wasn't one for years and years and years. And I do wonder if it's the same problem there. I mean, there are some chemistries that have been posited to work. But, I think, again, it might actually have been Musk who said this. You can't run your car off a PowerPoint presentation about a battery technology. You have to actually make one. So far, there has not been. And that I think, at the end of the day, it's not like people aren't trying. I think that anyone who says that we aren't trying for better battery technologies is a fantasist, because there's so much money available for anyone who comes up with a workable battery technology that, the pot of the gold at the end of that rainbow is vast and unthinkably huge. So I don't think there's any problem with people trying for this.
At the end of the day, lithium batteries are getting cheaper all the time. And I think everybody recognises they're not the ideal battery technology, but they are getting much cheaper. And lithium is a relatively common mineral. So it's not the answer, but I don't think it's going to slow down our adoption of electric vehicles. That might take us into a sort of golden age where we can actually use plentiful natural renewable power, because we will have this distributed battery capability, this virtual power station that resides in people's cars. Yeah. I think that's a marvelous idea. That's great sideways thinking.
I mean, just going back to that road system that I mentioned earlier, one of the things that was positive about that was about being able to charge your car as you're driving along.
Just because that particular one didn't take off, it doesn't mean that something similar wouldn't happen. So I'm not going to answer that doorbell.
Well, not my mic over, it'll be fine. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions to ask about, solar power. Is it plausibly going to pay for itself this far north in the UK? Is wave power doable? Is the ecological fallout of putting in tidal barrages doable? All of these things are questions that are worth asking and answering. But I don't think that I've seen evidence that in Gestalt overall, there's not a solution to this. And I think that the only reason that it's not being pursued is because people are risk averse. And it is reasonable to be risk averse. But I think that what doesn't get recognized, as with so many other scenarios, is that doing nothing is also a decision. And not making a decision is not absolving anybody from responsibility for the outcome.
Yeah, and I think it's, as you say, Phil, just because something isn't a 100% solution to something, or isn't 100% perfect, that isn't a reason not to embark on trying to do something or trying to do it. I think, we're coming up to about an hour again. The time has gone very quickly, but I think that was another good discussion. But I think we'll leave it there. Has anyone got any final thoughts to add?
Nothing profound. I was just going to say, let's recharge our batteries ready for coming out next week.
That's a good one. Well, we'll reconvene next week for another topic, but thanks, guys. It's been good to speak to you again.
All right. See you. Bye.
Have a good one.